So let me just start with a question for you. Why do we have one set of rules for, say, an architect whose bad design causes an injury,
Right.
and a completely different set of rules when a doctor's alleged negligence leads to a tragedy? It just, I don't know, it feels intuitively wrong.
It does. It absolutely does. And that tension, that's really what we're diving into today.
This idea of the individual's right to justice versus something bigger.
Exactly. Versus the need to protect systems that are, essential for all of us. The law treats these things differently, but not because one job is morally superior.
It's not about doctors being better people.
Not at all. It's about the potential for what's called systemic harm.
Okay, systemic harm. That's the concept we need to lock onto right away. Because if a truck driver makes a terrible, negligent mistake,
Mm.
the damage is horrible, for sure. But it's localized.
It's localized. It doesn't usually threaten the entire freight industry.
Or stop thousands of other people from getting goods delivered.
Precisely. And our mission today is to unpack the very specific legal and constitutional reasons why medical liability gets viewed through that systemic lens.
We're looking at sources from Florida law, I see.
We are, but this framework really applies everywhere. It's built on a landmark case called Kluger v. White. And you should think of Kluger as, well, like a constitutional contract.
A contract that the legislature has to follow if it wants to limit your right to go to court.
That's it, exactly.
So let's unpack that contract. This case, it sounds like it sets a hard boundary on what lawmakers can do.
It's the absolute boundary. It says you cannot just take away the people's right to seek justice for an injury because it's convenient or, politically popular.
But the right isn't absolute, is it?
It's not. But restricting it is supposed to be incredibly difficult. For the legislature to put limits on civil remedies like damage caps, which Florida did back in 1990, they have to meet two very, very specific conditions
Simultaneously.
simultaneously. It's a two-part test, and you have to pass both.
Okay, so what are they? What are these two prerequisites for the government to touch your constitutional rights?
Condition one, there has to be an overpowering public necessity. And that's not just a preference. It has to be a genuine existential threat to public welfare,
An emergency.
a true emergency. And condition two, even if that emergency is real, there can be no reasonable alternative method available to fix it. You have to pick the least restrictive path possible.
Wow. Okay, so that sets a really high bar. It makes it sound like limiting your access to the courts should be the absolute last resort.
It should be, only for a genuine crisis. Now, historically, back in 1990, the Florida legislature argued they'd met that first condition.
They declared a crisis.
They did. They argued that rising malpractice costs were a threat to healthcare all across the state, an overpowering public necessity, and that justification, for better or worse, has been treated like a chronic systemic emergency ever since.
But I want to jump in with a caveat here, because just because the legislature said so 30 years ago doesn't give them a free pass forever, right?
Absolutely not. The U.S. Supreme Court is very clear on this. Any restriction on a fundamental right has to be the least restrictive means.
Yeah.
And it must last only as long as the emergency continues.
So it's a temporary permission slip.
It's not a permanent change to the social contract.
Yeah.
Exactly. If the facts on the ground change or if this emergency just goes on and on without fixing the problem, then the whole justification starts to look, well, constitutionally shaky.
Which brings us back to the original question. Why did this necessity come up for medicine in the first place? Why does medicine get this special treatment?
Well, again, it's not moral status. Common law has seen medicine as distinct for centuries, purely because of the nature of the work itself.
The practical realities.
The practical realities. In fact, our sources identify 5 specific factors that make medical practice just fundamentally different from, say, running a construction company.
Okay, let's hear them. What are the 5?
First, the work is inherently dangerous. I mean, you're dealing with invasive procedures, powerful drugs. There's an immediate high-stakes risk to life.
Unlike building a deck.
Right. Second, it's probabilistic, not certain. A great surgeon can do everything perfectly, and the patient can still have a terrible outcome. A contractor basically guarantees the work. A doctor guarantees the treatment, not the outcome.
That makes sense. There's a high chance of a bad outcome even when the standard of care is met. So what are the other 3?
Third, it's often done under extreme time pressure. An ER, a surgical suite. You're making snap judgments.
With incomplete information, I'd imagine. That has to be the 4th one.
That's number 4. Dependent on incomplete information. A patient might not be able to communicate their history, or a disease presents in a weird way. You don't have time for endless analysis.
You can't just tell the trauma surgeon, hey, hold on, let's get a second opinion.
You can't. And fifth, and this is maybe the most crucial point, the practice of medicine is essential to the survival of the population.
If a construction company goes under, another one will pop up.
But if a rural hospital has to close its maternity ward because the malpractice insurance is just too high,
Then people in that town lose access. Real people are harmed.
real people lose essential care. And that's why we have all these controls like licensing and continuing education. They aren't perks. They are controls we impose because the stakes are so high.
And this is where the whole conversation shifts, doesn't it? It moves from legal theory to something much more raw.
It does. We call it the emotional pivot. Because when one of those probabilistic bad outcomes actually happens, grief takes over. And grief demands a reason. It demands accountability.
And in that moment of grief, that whole context we just discussed, the high risks, the time pressure, the incomplete information, it all just evaporates.
It vanishes. It's human nature. Suddenly, a tragic outcome within a dangerous system gets recast as a moral failure.
Or personal wrongdoing, an injustice that needs to be punished.
And punished with the biggest financial penalty possible.
But what you're saying is the law can't operate purely on that emotion.
It can't, because the consequences ripple out way beyond the people in that courtroom. And this gets us back to localized versus systemic harm.
The core of the whole thing.
It's the engine of the entire argument. A negligent driver causes localized harm. The cost is contained. But a huge malpractice verdict. That cost doesn't just stay with the one doctor.
It gets redistributed.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Across the entire system.
And that's the systemic harm. How does that actually, what does that look like in the real world?
Oh, it's devastating. You see insurance companies just pull out of the market. Hospitals shut down high-risk services like trauma centers or OB/GYN wards.
Because the liability is just too great.
Exactly. And maybe worst of all, doctors start practicing defensive medicine.
Ordering a million tests they don't need just to cover themselves.
Or, even more tragically, avoiding the high-risk patients who need their help the most.
So the suffering spreads. It spreads to people who were never in a courtroom, never even met the people in the lawsuit. They just happen to live in a town where the maternity ward closed down.
And that is the overpowering public necessity. That's what satisfies prong 1 of the Kluger test.
Which is also why the analogy you sometimes hear, comparing it to car insurance, just doesn't work.
It completely breaks down. Auto liability is a massive, private, non-essential risk pool. Malpractice insurance is a tiny, highly specialized pool that is directly tied to whether or not your community has health care.
They aren't interchangeable at all.
Not even close. When your car insurance goes up, you pay more. When malpractice insurance goes up, your community may lose its hospital.
Okay, so the legislature argues this systemic threat is real. They satisfy prong 1 of the constitutional contract. They can limit civil remedies.
Yes, but that's only half the battle.
And this is where it all went wrong in Florida, isn't it? The failure to meet prong 2.
This is where the whole system became indefensible. They broke the bargain.
Because the implicit promise was, okay, we're going to limit your ability to sue for a huge payout.
But in exchange, right?
In exchange, we promise you something else. We promise robust, reciprocal accountability to keep you safe.
Exactly. Strong administrative oversight, meaningful discipline for bad doctors, transparent investigations, feedback loops, so the same mistakes don't happen over and over.
That was a reasonable alternative.
But that was supposed to be the trade-off. It was supposed to replace the jury's role in policing the profession.
But that's not what happened.
That is where the critique becomes absolutely damning. The legislature weakened the civil courts with caps, and then they simultaneously failed to strengthen the regulatory agencies.
They took away the jury's hammer, but didn't give the public any other tool.
The results were, frankly, catastrophic for accountability. We saw complaints against doctors getting dismissed with no explanation. The Department of Health let doctors with patterns of negligence keep practicing for years.
So there was no transparency. The public had no way of knowing who the problem practitioners were.
And if your system is set up to allow that, to let known risks continue causing harm because the administrative discipline is so weak, then the limits on your right to sue become indefensible.
You lose both ways. You have no protection and no recourse.
Exactly. The problem wasn't treating medicine differently. The problem was that only half of the constitutional justification was ever honored. It stopped looking like a reasoned policy choice and started looking like, well, just plain privilege.
You know, that gets to a really critical error in the public debate. This idea that equality means identical treatment for everyone and everything.
Right, which is just not how law works.
We differentiate all the time between children and adults, between banks and regular businesses?
Of course. A mature legal system needs reasoned differentiation. It just has to be tied to a legitimate public goal. The problem isn't differentiation itself.
The problem is when it becomes a one-way street.
That's the perfect way to put it. When differentiation lacks that reciprocal accountability, it stops being reasoned and it just becomes privilege.
So if you're going to limit jury verdicts to protect the system,
Then the regulatory agencies, your Department of Health, your Agency for Healthcare Administration,
yeah,
they have to become the primary guardians of public safety. They have to be proactive.
they need to make it easy to file a complaint. They need to investigate everything thoroughly.
And discipline meaningfully. And use what they find, not just to punish one person, but to spot systemic failures and fix them. That's what the failure of Kluge-Prong 2 really means. When those agencies fail, the public gets betrayed twice.
So the solution isn't to pretend medicine is the same as every other job.
No, not at all. The path forward is to complete the bargain. The legislature has to finally fulfill its side of that constitutional contract.
The deep message from all this is that if you're going to limit one form of accountability, you absolutely must strengthen another.
You have to. You must make the system safer and more worthy of public trust through rigorous regulation. That's not anti-government. That's pro-governance. It's what Kluger v. White demanded all along.
And we even see evidence that this failure is being acknowledged now, right? In recommendations to repeal those caps while at the same time strengthening the very agencies tasked with licensing and discipline.
That's a huge tell. It's basically an executive-level admission that the regulatory safety net failed.
Ultimately, the law has to hold two seemingly competing truths at the same time.
It does. Individuals deserve justice when they are harmed, full stop.
Yeah.
And societies have to protect the essential systems that sustain everyone.
The job is to fix the structure so that accountability and access can coexist, so they don't have to compete.
And that really leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. Think about the structures in your own life. Maybe it's the airline industry, or financial oversight, or even public schools. What system do you rely on that needs both immediate individual accountability when something goes wrong, but also robust systemic protection to make sure that service is still there for everyone else tomorrow? That balance, that's the constitutional contract we all live under.